In this video, I'm going to walk you through the process of bringing in a low poly mesh that already contains UVs. We'll bring that over to this sculpt space. We can add some fine detail sculpting, and then we'll export that newly applied sculpt out as a displacement map. And then we can preview that on our low poly mesh all in one session. Okay, so the first thing we want to do to get started is use this Paint UV map mesh per pixel to bring in your mesh. The reason we use this is because it will bring in the UVs along with that mesh. We'll just accept all the default settings. We won't subdivide anything. And sure, we can keep the 2K textures. Hit OK. Okay, and there we go. Now we've got this mesh. And if you look under your texture editor, by the way, I'm using my own layout. If you're not using a layout similar to what I have, you can always bring in any of these panels through the Windows panels, and then you can just bring those in and dock them wherever you want. I just make sure that I have the texture editor available and my paint objects available. All right. Oh, and this got buried down there, but I think by default you might have layer and sculpt tree, but make sure you have those as well. Other than that, we'll be fine with everything else. So now, in order to get this mesh into the sculpt space, we'll go to Bake, and then we'll choose one of these options. If you use Paint Mesh Sculpt, it'll just bring this subdivided into the sculpt space. But if you bring it in with this Paint Mesh Subdivide sculpt, you have the option to subdivide it as much as you want. So let's just go ahead and use this, and I'll show you what I mean. So here's a preview of the mesh that's going to come in, and you can see that it's faceted because it didn't add the subdivision yet. We're only at 3000 poly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the subdivide option, and I'm just going to subdivide that a few times to make sure it's got enough resolution. For this example, I'm going to go one more. So we've got just under 1 million polys. That's fine. We'll just hit apply. And now you can see it's a fairly dense mesh. So the first thing we're going to do is just start adding some details. If you hit 4 on your keyboard, by the way, it toggles between wireframe and solid. Wireframe, if you leave wireframe on, it's okay, but it will tend to tax your CPU. So I just leave it shaded. It's easier to see as well. You can also go under your view, and you can toggle it from here as well. Here it says to use the W key. I end up using the 4 key. They both do the same thing. So here's W, and here's 4. Okay, so let's start adding some features. First thing I'll do is it's not going to be pretty. I'll just start placing some eyes. You know what, let's undo that. Let's add symmetry. Hit S on your keyboard and choose the X plane or whatever plane for your object. Okay. And then we don't need to look at that plane. Actually, we can just hide the symmetry plane. Okay. So let's go back. All right, and we'll just add a little bit detail here. This is not thought out, so I'm just trying to add some features in here that are going to be really obvious to see. All right. Let's just say we have something like this. Maybe take some of that out. Okay. Definitely have some stuff going on here. Okay, so now let's get these displacements extracted out. So the first thing we do is we'll jump over to the retopo space. Go to retopo. And right away, what you're going to see is you're going to see your low poly mesh. Let me put wireframe on, sitting on top of your sculpted details. This low poly mesh, if you look under your UV preview, again, if you don't have the panels that I have, all these panels are available to you under the Windows panel. So just go ahead and just bring them in if you don't have them. Okay, so you can see there's no UVs previewed on this mesh that we see here. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead under this paint objects, just hide that because that's not actually the mesh we want. Okay, so now we have two options. We can either import under mesh, import the low poly mesh that has UVs, or since you brought in the low poly mesh in the paint room that already has the UVs, we can just go under mesh, take mesh from paint room, and when we do it this way, now you'll see the sample texture grid that you get from your UVs, and your UV preview actually shows UVs. So now that we have that, we can begin the baking process. Okay, so now we want to grab those details. We'll just hit bake, and we'll use this bake with normal map plus flat displacement. So we'll click that. And now we're presented with this scan depth pop-up. And the way this works is it's going to shoot rays and evaluate where the displacements are. And right now what you can see is that the displacements are actually popping through this the bounds that they've already set for you. So what we want to do is we're going to go to this outer shell, and we're going to just basically, we can increase that size as so. Or I want to keep a little bit of space above the model surface. Okay, so what we're going to do is we want to push out the cage above these features. And we don't have to swell the entire scan depth. What we can do is we can just paint over these areas and they will swell it like that. So now we've got a little bit of distance there, a little bit of distance there, and there we go. And add a little bit more here just to cover my bases. All right, so now we're fine there, but we can take a look at the inside shell as well, just to make sure nothing's popping out. And the reason we want to check this is because in some of these cases, I actually push the mesh in, like the eyes and the side of the head. So we want to make sure we capture that information as well. So now we can just start painting in this area, like so. And we can always show the ghosting, just to make sure that we're putting enough space. And I'll paint that down. And now I can check just to make sure. Looks like I have plenty of space. Perfect. All right, so that's it. Now we'll just hit OK. And at this point, we can decide whether a 2K map is going to be good enough for what we need, or we can go to a higher resolution. Let's just go to 4K in this case, so I can show you a good representation. And also, if we want to view this displacement map, it's probably a good idea now to increase this initial subdivision. You're still going to have your low poly mesh, but this will give you a preview mesh. So we want to make sure that that's got enough resolution. So maybe what we'll do is we'll just do it 100,000 for this example and hit OK. All right, so it looks like we're done. We can jump to the paint room. And from here, I think the first thing I like to do is just go under View and make sure that you have Show Voxels in Paint Room disabled. If you have it enabled, you're going to see the actual sculpt mesh popping through, which is not your wire mesh or your low poly mesh. So sometimes that can be confusing. So I typically just don't show that in the paint room. There we go. So what we're looking at here is actually the normal map. As you can see that it's not really pushing out any of that displacement. And if you look under your layers in your paint room, you'll see that normal map is enabled. You can disable it. And now we're back to that original mesh. But there's also this flat displacement that got written out. So if I enable that, you'll see that now I actually do have that displacement. Okay, so now I can either toggle back and forth through here, or I can just go to this sculpt room and I can just toggle from here. So here's the difference. This is the displacement. So maybe the resolution wasn't quite high enough, but if I show the sculpt, that's the sculpt, and that's the displacement map. Now, if you want to get that displacement map into a file or into an actual map that you can use in another application, all you need to do is go under Textures, Export, and then you can say Displacement Map Current or All Visible Layers. We'll just do All Visible Layers because there's only one displacement layer. So you can say All Textures. This is really useful if you have UDIMs. Right now, we're actually just looking at the default, so we'll just actually stick that to default. Say OK. I typically use the gray. Say OK. And now I'm going to write this into a file and then open it for you. So let me save this out really quick. And my depth factor is saved, and it's because it's not normalized, it's giving me these values. Just say OK. And now let me open. So there's a displacement map that we just made. Well, that's basically it. I hope this was helpful. Thanks for watching.